My stepbrother shouted, "You're throwing 3 children onto the street." I looked past him at the relatives crowded across my driveway, all of them holding boxes they had brought to pressure me, and said, "Then one of you can open your home to him. Mine is not available." A year earlier, if someone had asked which person in my family disliked me most, I would have answered without hesitation, Mason Reed. He was 32, barely older than me, and for most of our lives, he had treated reminding me that I was not his real sister like a personal mission. The irony was almost impressive. Mason only discovered the word family when he decided he needed the house I had bought and renovated myself. My father married Mason's mother, Valerie, when I was 9. We were living in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, and I remember believing the wedding would finally give me the family I had always imagined. My biological mother had died when I was 4, so the idea of having a stepmother and an older brother felt like a second beginning. On the wedding morning, I approached Mason with a small wooden keychain I had painted by hand. It was dark green with a silver mountain on it because I had heard him telling someone those were his favorite colors. I had spent several evenings sanding the edges and repainting the mountain whenever the lines looked uneven. He stared at it for a moment, placed it back in my palm, and said, "I'm not your brother. Don't tell people I am." I was standing there in a pale yellow dress, surrounded by adults who gave uncomfortable little laughs and said he was probably nervous about the marriage. But Mason was not nervous. He meant it, and he spent the next 20 years proving it. Whenever a teacher called us brother and sister, he corrected them in front of everyone. At family gatherings, he interrupted introductions to explain that we were only connected because our parents had married. When his friends visited, he referred to me as my mom's husband's daughter, as though even saying my name might create a relationship he did not want. For years, I kept trying anyway. I invited him to ride bikes with me, watch movies, or come along when my friends went to the riverfront. Most of the time, he ignored me. When he did acknowledge me, it was usually to embarrass me. In 7th grade, he told people I had been removed from the school choir because I cried during auditions. I had never auditioned. Another time, he claimed I still slept with a stuffed rabbit and called my father whenever thunderstorms started. None of it was true, but Mason understood early that a confident lie travels faster than a quiet correction. Valerie occasionally told him to be kinder to me. His answer was always the same: "She isn't my sister." Valerie would sigh, ask him not to start an argument, and let the matter disappear. My father said Mason was still struggling with his parents' divorce and needed time. Apparently, he needed decades.
Things became even more obvious after my younger half-brother Eli was born. Mason adored him immediately. Eli shared his mother's blood, which apparently made him legitimate in a way I could never be. Mason constantly told him that he had one real brother and one girl who only happened to live in the same house. Eli was too young to understand at first, but children eventually notice the things adults repeat. One evening when he was 6, Eli came into my room holding a toy truck and asked, "Why does Mason hate you?" I had no answer for him. Nobody did, because no one in our house ever dealt with uncomfortable problems directly. My father wanted peace. Valerie wanted Mason calm. Mason wanted complete freedom to behave however he pleased. That left me with the only role available, the person expected to stay quiet so everyone else could remain comfortable. By 13, I finally stopped trying to win him over. I stopped asking him to spend time with me. I stopped inviting him anywhere. I stopped hoping he might wake up one morning and decide I was worth treating like a human being. In high school, we barely spoke unless our parents forced us to sit at the same table. Mason spent most weekends at parties, while I worked evenings at a small building supply store near Gresham. I unloaded deliveries, organized shelves, cut keys, and mixed custom paint for customers who always seemed to arrive 5 minutes before closing. Every paycheck went into a savings account. Mason thought that was hilarious. He would come home late on Saturday nights, see me eating leftovers in my work uniform, and tell me I was wasting the best years of my life. According to him, I was supposed to be traveling, dating, buying expensive clothes, and doing something more exciting than counting boxes of screws. Maybe my teenage years were boring. I did not take glamorous vacations. I did not own designer bags. I drove an old Honda with a passenger window that occasionally refused to close. But I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted independence. After graduation, I earned financial aid and enrolled in a civil engineering program in Eugene. I worked evening shifts at a campus maintenance office and spent summers inspecting road projects for a local contractor. It was exhausting, but I finished my degree with very little debt.
A few months later, I was hired by an engineering firm that designed drainage systems, pedestrian bridges, and public infrastructure. The work was not flashy, but it was stable. I learned quickly, accepted every difficult assignment I could, and built my career one promotion at a time. By 30, I was not wealthy, but I was secure. I had no credit card debt, a reliable car, an emergency fund, and enough savings for a down payment. Then I found the house. It stood in an older neighborhood outside Salem, at the end of a street lined with maple trees. It had 3 bedrooms, a narrow office, a detached garage, and a backyard that had been completely swallowed by weeds. The kitchen looked untouched since the early 90s, and the wooden deck leaned slightly to one side. Most buyers saw repairs. I saw possibility. I bought it 4 years ago without help from anyone in my family. No one co-signed the loan, no one contributed to the down payment. Every dollar came from years of working, saving, and saying no to things I could not afford. For the next 2 years, nearly every weekend belonged to that house. I tore out old flooring, repainted every room, replaced damaged cabinets, rebuilt the deck, and learned how to install tile through online tutorials. A coworker helped me repair the garage roof, but nearly everything else I did myself. I made plenty of mistakes. I measured boards incorrectly, cracked tiles, painted one wall the wrong shade, and once spent an entire afternoon installing a door backward. But slowly, the house became mine in more than name. The first evening after I finished the kitchen, I sat on the new counter eating noodles from a paper container. I looked at the clean cabinets, the warm lights, and the floor I had installed plank by plank. Then I cried. Not because I was sad, because for the first time in my life, I was standing inside something nobody could take credit for but me.
Mason's life moved in the opposite direction. He married a woman named Tessa and started a residential roofing company. For several years, the business did well. He had crews working across the Portland suburbs, contracts booked months in advance, and enough income to live comfortably. But Mason had never been interested in comfortable. He and Tessa leased 2 expensive vehicles, rented a house far larger than they needed, and filled it with furniture that looked designed for magazine photographs rather than actual living. Every summer brought another vacation, every holiday another mountain of gifts, and every birthday party for their 3 children looked like a professionally organized event. Their social media showed matching outfits, luxury cabins, restaurant tables covered in food, and captions about building the life they deserved. At family dinners, whenever someone complimented my house, Mason found a way to dismiss it. "It's fine for one person," he once said. "A little too quiet for me." The only time he visited after I completed most of the renovations, he walked through each room without saying anything positive. He opened cabinet doors, examined the backyard, and stood for a long time in the largest bedroom. Before leaving, he looked around my living room and said, "It's strange for one woman to have this much space. You'll probably marry eventually and move somewhere else." I assumed it was another insult. Later, I realized he had been evaluating the place. After that visit, we returned to our usual pattern. We saw each other at holidays, exchanged a few polite sentences, and otherwise stayed out of each other's lives. Mason rarely contacted me unless he needed help carrying something heavy or repairing equipment. Apparently, I was not family when introductions were involved, but I became family whenever a washing machine needed moving. Then, last autumn, his roofing company began to collapse. 3 large projects were delayed after a supplier dispute. 1 customer refused payment and filed a lawsuit over water damage. Mason lost 2 experienced crews within the same month, and several commercial clients canceled their contracts. Instead of reducing expenses, he borrowed more money. He financed new equipment he did not need, used credit cards to cover payroll, and insisted that one major contract would solve everything. He told relatives the company was experiencing a temporary slowdown, and accused anyone who questioned him of being negative. The contract never came. Within months, creditors took most of his equipment. 1 vehicle was repossessed outside a grocery store. The other disappeared from their driveway 2 weeks later. Mason and Tessa fell behind on rent, utilities, and nearly every other bill. Then Tessa left.
She packed several bags, took the children to her sister's home in Nevada, and told Mason she could no longer survive his promises. A few weeks later, she sent the children back because her sister's apartment was too small and she needed time to find work. Suddenly, Mason had no company, no savings, no wife beside him, and 3 children depending on him. After the eviction notice became final, he moved into my father and Valerie's house. Their place had 4 bedrooms, but 1 belonged to my parents, 1 was Eli's, and another had been converted into Valerie's sewing room. That left Mason and all 3 children crowded into a single bedroom. According to my father, the arrangement became unbearable almost immediately. The children argued constantly because there was no privacy. Mason complained about the food, the internet, the noise, and the lack of space. He expected Valerie to watch the children while he searched for work, although no one could identify a single company where he had actually applied. Weeks became months. Valerie paid the insurance on his remaining pickup. My father covered groceries. Mason continued telling everyone he needed time to rebuild his confidence before accepting a job beneath his experience. Every phone call with my father became a report on the latest crisis. I listened, I sympathized, but I kept my distance. Mason's problems were painful, but they were not mine to solve. Then, one Saturday afternoon, my father called and said he and Valerie needed to visit me. "It's important," he said. His voice was so serious that I thought someone was ill. An hour later, they were sitting at my dining table, both avoiding my eyes. Valerie folded her hands and cleared her throat. "We've been discussing Mason's situation," she began. I nodded slowly. Then she looked around my dining room and said the sentence that made my stomach tighten. "You have so much room here, Nora."
The moment she said it, I understood where the conversation was going. Valerie leaned forward as though she were presenting a reasonable compromise. Your father and I thought Mason and the children could stay here for a little while, she said, only until he gets back on his feet. I looked at her, then at my father, who was studying the grain of the table. How long is a little while? Valerie glanced at him before answering. A few months, perhaps. That response told me there was no actual plan. A few months could become 6. 6 could become a year. Once 3 children were settled into bedrooms, everyone would suddenly decide moving them again was too cruel. Has Mason found a job? I asked. My father shook his head. Does he have interviews scheduled? Silence. Valerie finally said he was concentrating on helping the children adjust first. Mason had already been living with them for nearly 3 months, so I was not sure what adjustment still prevented him from sending applications. Then she took a slow breath. There may be another arrangement that makes more sense. Something in her voice warned me that the first request had only been preparation. What arrangement? Well, she said carefully, perhaps you could stay with us temporarily. For several seconds, I genuinely believed I had misunderstood her. You want me to stay at your house? She nodded. That way, Mason and the children could use this place. There are enough bedrooms for everyone, and the kids would finally have some stability. I laughed. Nothing about it was funny, but the idea was so outrageous that my brain produced laughter before anger. Let me make sure I understand, I said. Mason does not want to live here with me. He wants me to leave my own house so he can live in it without me. Valerie immediately raised her hands. It is not like that. Then explain how it is different. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and looked at my father. He finally spoke. Nora, you are one person. Mason has 3 children. Then Valerie added, a young woman does not really need an entire house alone. You may marry someday and start somewhere new. Mason needs the space now. I sat there in silence. Around us was the dining room I had renovated myself. I had stripped the old wallpaper, repaired the cracked plaster, installed the light fixture, and refinished the floor. I remembered weekends spent covered in dust because I could not afford professional help. I remembered eating sandwiches on an overturned bucket before I owned furniture. Now they were sitting at my table, asking me to pack a suitcase because Mason had decided his need outweighed my ownership. Was this his idea? I asked. My father exhaled slowly. Yes, of course it was. Valerie reached toward my hand. He is under enormous pressure. I pulled my hand away. He spent 20 years telling everyone I was not his family. That happened when you were children.
Last Christmas, his youngest daughter asked who I was. Mason introduced me as Grandpa Daniel's daughter, not Aunt Nora, not his sister. That was 8 months ago. Neither of them responded. Has he apologized? Silence. Has he admitted he treated me badly? More silence. Has he even called me himself to ask for help? My father quietly answered, no. I nodded. So he believes he does not owe me a phone call, but I owe him my house. Valerie's expression tightened. No one is asking you to give him the house. If I move out, he moves in without rent, without a lease, and without an agreed departure date. What would you call it? She repeated that it would be temporary. How temporary? Neither of them could answer. I already knew how arrangements like that ended. 3 months became 6, 6 became 12, then the children were settled and asking Mason to leave became heartless. Every delay would become my responsibility, and every boundary would be treated like cruelty. So I answered clearly, no. Valerie blinked. No? No discussion, no trial period, no reconsidering it later. Mason and his children are not moving into my house, and I am not moving out. My father lowered his eyes. Valerie looked at me as if I had betrayed her. I thought we raised you to help family. That sentence ignited something inside me. Family? I repeated. Where was that word while Mason spent decades announcing that I was not his sister? He was young. He is 32. People change. Has he changed? I asked. Or has he only discovered that I am family now because I own something he wants? My father quietly suggested a compromise. What if they moved in while you stayed here too? Absolutely not. Why? Because he would never leave. Valerie frowned. That is unfair. No. It is predictable.
He already believes this house should belong to him, I said. If I let him move in, 6 months from now he will say the children are settled and cannot be uprooted again. Then you will sit at the same table and ask me to wait a little longer because making them leave would be cruel. Neither of them answered. They knew exactly how that conversation would go. In our family, the calm person was always expected to compromise. Mason created the problem, everyone became exhausted, and eventually I was asked to surrender something so peace could return. That had been the pattern since childhood. I was simply refusing to play my assigned role. Valerie stood and smoothed the front of her blouse. I am deeply disappointed in you. I am disappointed you thought this was acceptable to ask. My father hugged me before leaving, but the gesture felt stiff and uncertain. Valerie walked to the car without another word. I believed that would end it. I had given them a direct answer. They had heard it. There was nothing left to negotiate. 3 days later, my phone began vibrating during a project meeting at work. I ignored it until lunch, then discovered 17 missed calls and dozens of messages. Most were from relatives I rarely spoke to. One aunt wrote, "How can you do this to innocent children?" A cousin said, "I never imagined you were this selfish."
Someone else told me I should be ashamed for choosing an empty house over family. I stood in the office kitchen staring at the screen, completely confused. I had not spoken to any of these people about Mason. Then I opened social media. At the top of my feed was a long public post from him. He never mentioned my name, but he did not need to. He wrote about losing his company, being abandoned by his wife, and trying to raise 3 children alone. He described himself as a struggling father who had asked one wealthy relative for temporary help. According to his version, that relative lived alone in a large house with several unused bedrooms, but cared more about property than family. He claimed his children were sleeping on the floor because someone who pretended to love them had slammed the door in their faces. That part made my hands shake. No one had ever brought the children to my door. Mason had never even asked me himself. His post had hundreds of reactions and comments. Strangers called me cold, spoiled, greedy, and cruel without knowing who I was or hearing a single fact from my side. Worse, several relatives had joined them. People who had watched Mason reject me for decades were suddenly writing that family should always help family. Apparently, his definition of our relationship became acceptable the moment it required something from me. I did not respond publicly. Instead, I took screenshots of the post. Every comment, every message, and every timestamp. Something told me I might need proof later. That evening, Mason called. Against my better judgment, I answered. He did not say hello. You humiliated my mother. I almost laughed. I humiliated Valerie?
She cried after leaving your house because you refused to help us. No, I said. She was upset because she finally heard how unreasonable the request sounded when I repeated it back to her. His voice changed instantly. You are really going to punish my children over something that happened when we were kids? This is not about childhood. Then what is it about? You want me to leave my own home so you can occupy it for free? He released a long, irritated breath. You do not need all that space. You live alone. That is not your decision. You are being selfish. Maybe, I said, but I did not spend 20 years telling someone she was not family and then suddenly change my mind when I wanted her house. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he replied with complete confidence. Mom agrees with me. That sentence explained everything. Mason believed he would win because Valerie had always protected him from consequences. Every rule disappeared once she decided keeping him calm mattered more than being fair. But I was no longer a child living in her house. This was my property. Her disappointment did not put her name on the mortgage. Valerie can agree with you, I said. The answer is still no. I ended the call. I assumed Mason would complain online for another week and eventually accept reality. Once again, I underestimated him. 2 nights later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Eli calling from college. I braced myself for another lecture, but the first thing he said was, I know you told them no. Those words affected me more than I expected. Eli said he had seen Mason's post and heard the relatives arguing in the family group chat. He knew exactly how Mason operated because he had watched the same pattern his entire life. Mason created a crisis, exaggerated it, and waited for everyone else to solve it. I'm sorry I wasn't there when Dad and Mom came to your house, he said. I would have told them this was insane. For the first time that week, I felt less alone. Before ending the call, Eli mentioned something strange. The family group chat, which had been full of angry messages for days, had suddenly become quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. At the time, I assumed everyone had finally lost interest. I should have known better. People do not always become silent because they have accepted an answer. Sometimes they become silent because they are organizing something. The following Saturday, I was mowing the front lawn when a dark SUV slowed near my house and turned into the driveway. A sedan followed it. Then came a pickup truck pulling a small trailer loaded with plastic bins, suitcases, and folded furniture. I switched off the mower and stared. The SUV belonged to my Aunt Denise. Mason stepped out of the passenger side wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, as though this were an ordinary weekend project. Doors opened along the driveway and relatives began unloading boxes. For several seconds, I could not process what I was seeing. One cousin lifted a storage bin from the trailer. Another carried folded chairs. Aunt Denise removed grocery bags from the back seat and started walking toward my porch. Then Mason noticed me. Perfect timing, he called. I walked toward him slowly. What are you doing? Moving in, he replied. He said it casually, as if we had agreed on everything days ago. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh or admit it was some elaborate joke. He did neither. 2 cousins were already stacking boxes beside the garage. Mason's children climbed out of the second vehicle, looking tired and confused. Valerie stepped from the sedan behind them and immediately avoided my eyes. My father was nowhere in sight. That was the first detail I registered clearly. Have you completely lost your mind? I asked. Mason rolled his eyes. Everyone discussed it. We agreed this is the best arrangement for the children. Who is everyone? The people in this family who actually care. One of my cousins gave me an uncertain smile. We were told you had changed your mind after talking with Valerie. I looked directly at him. Did I tell you that? His smile disappeared. Well, no.
Did anyone here call me and ask? Nobody answered. The driveway became strangely still. Several relatives stood holding boxes, suddenly unsure where to place them. Mason stepped closer and lowered his voice.
Look, we all know how stubborn you can be. We thought once the kids were actually here, you would stop making this difficult. That was when I understood the plan. He had not misunderstood my answer. He had decided my answer did not matter. Mason believed that if he arrived with his children, a trailer full of belongings, and enough relatives to form an audience, I would be too embarrassed to send them away. He had built the entire scheme around public pressure. Unfortunately for him, he had spent most of his life refusing to know me. He still thought I was the child who stayed quiet whenever the family wanted peace. His youngest daughter came over and tugged gently on my shirt. "Can I see the room where I'm going to sleep?" she asked. My anger cracked for a moment. None of this was her fault. I crouched beside her and said, "There is a nice backyard with a bird feeder. Maybe you can visit sometime." She smiled. Then I stood, walked past every adult in the driveway, climbed my porch steps, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. I closed the door behind me, then I locked it. Through the front window, I watched the relatives look at one another in confusion. Some were still holding boxes. Others stood beside the trailer as though they were waiting for someone to explain what came next. 30 seconds later, my phone rang. "Mason," I answered. "Open the door," he demanded. "No, stop making a scene." I looked around my quiet living room. "You are trying to move into a house that does not belong to you. I am standing inside my own home. Which one of us is making the scene?" He breathed heavily into the phone. "The children are outside in the sun. Then take them somewhere you actually have permission to enter." "You are seriously doing this in front of everyone?" "Yes." He hung up. A few moments later, someone began pounding on the front door. The knocking became louder, followed by Valerie's voice. "Nora, please come outside so we can discuss this calmly." I opened the door only wide enough to step onto the porch, then closed it behind me and stood directly in front of it. Valerie looked exhausted. "Sweetheart, do not call me sweetheart while helping someone move into my home after I already told you no." Her expression collapsed. She admitted the plan had been Mason's idea, but insisted she had come because she hoped seeing the children and the whole family together would soften me. I stared at her. "If I arrived at your house with a trailer full of furniture after you refused to let me move in, what would you do?" She said nothing. Mason answered for her. "That is completely different." "How?" "Because you do not have children." There it was again. Every argument always returned to the same belief. Because Mason had children, his needs automatically mattered more than mine. My years of saving, working late, and renovating the house meant nothing compared with his decision to become a father and then mismanage every part of his life. I stepped toward the edge of the porch and addressed everyone in the driveway. Did anyone ask whether Mason offered to pay rent? Silence. Did anyone ask whether he would contribute to electricity, water, food, or repairs? No one spoke. Did anyone ask how long he intended to stay? Aunt Denise shifted uncomfortably. "We assumed it would only be a few months." I turned to Mason. "How many?" He crossed his arms. "Until I am financially stable." "That is not a number." 6 months? He stared at me. 1 year? Nothing. 2 years? Still nothing. His silence answered more clearly than words.
There was no deadline, no rental agreement, no payment, no plan for employment. Mason expected to enter my house and remain there until he personally decided he was ready to leave. Once he was inside, removing him would become my problem. I would be the cruel relative forcing children from their bedrooms. I would pay any legal costs. I would absorb the damage, the utility bills, and the family's anger. I looked at the cousins holding his boxes. "You carried those here because Mason told you I had agreed?" "I never agreed. I refused in person, over the phone, and through text messages." One cousin slowly lowered his box. "Mason said Valerie convinced you." "She did not." Everyone turned toward him. Aunt Denise frowned. "Is that true?" Mason lifted both hands. "She is twisting the story. That is what she always does." I did not argue. I pulled out my phone, opened the conversation with my father, and handed it to Denise. The messages were unmistakable. My father asking me to reconsider. My answer? No. Another request 2 days later. Another clear refusal. There were no mixed signals, no uncertainty, and no sentence that could reasonably be interpreted as permission. Denise read the entire exchange without speaking. Then she handed the phone back to me, picked up the grocery bags she had left near the porch, and carried them toward her SUV. One of my cousins placed his box back on the trailer. Then another did the same. The atmosphere shifted so suddenly that even Mason noticed. His audience had finally realized they had not been invited to help a desperate father move. They had been recruited to pressure someone who had already said no.
One by one, the relatives began carrying everything back to the vehicles. No one asked me to reconsider. No one tried to argue that I was being selfish. They avoided looking at Mason because they had all reached the same conclusion. He had lied to them. They believed they were helping with a move I had approved. In reality, they had been used as props in a public pressure campaign. Mason watched the driveway empty around him, and whatever control he had left disappeared. "You are all abandoning me," he shouted. He accused my cousins of being cowards. He yelled that the family was leaving his children homeless. Then he pointed at me and claimed I had planned the entire humiliation. "I knew you wanted revenge," he said. "You have been waiting for this your whole life." I stayed near the front door, keeping myself between the house and everyone else. "You came here without permission," I said. "You lied to these people and expected them to force me into giving you what you wanted. You humiliated yourself." That only made him louder. Then he turned on Valerie. "You never fight for me," he shouted. "A real mother would have made her understand." For the first time in my life, I saw Valerie's face change completely. She had spent decades calming Mason, defending him, and excusing his behavior. Whenever he became angry, everyone else was expected to retreat. But not this time. "Enough," she shouted. The entire driveway fell silent. Even the children stopped moving. Valerie looked directly at her son. "Nora told us no weeks ago. She told us more than once. I should have respected her answer the first time instead of helping you push past it." Mason stared at her as if she had betrayed him. "You are taking her side? I am taking the side that is right." Those words landed harder than anything else said that afternoon. For the first time since I was 9, Valerie was not asking the reasonable person to surrender so Mason could calm down. It had taken more than 20 years and a driveway full of embarrassed relatives, but she finally saw the pattern clearly. Mason looked around, waiting for someone to defend him. Nobody moved. My cousins continued loading the trailer. Anthony sat inside her SUV with the door closed. Even Mason's children stood quietly together, sensing that something important had changed. So Mason did what he always did when reality refused to cooperate. He blamed me again. "You turned everyone against me because I never accepted you as my sister." I almost laughed. After decades of denying our relationship, he had finally admitted the truth out loud. "You are right about one thing," I said. "You never accepted me as your sister."
His expression shifted, uncertain. "For more than 20 years, you corrected teachers when they called us siblings. You corrected relatives. You even corrected your own children when they called me Aunt Nora." He opened his mouth, but I continued. "You worked very hard to make sure nobody thought of us as family. Then, the moment you needed a free house, suddenly family became the most important thing in the world." The driveway was completely quiet now. "So which is it, Mason?" I asked. "Am I your sister or not?" For once, he had no answer. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. "That is what I thought." At that moment, my father's car stopped along the curb. He stepped out holding 2 grocery bags and froze when he saw the trailer, the boxes, and the relatives scattered around my driveway. His face told me he understood immediately. He set the bags in the car and hurried toward me. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," I said. "But this can never happen again." He nodded. Then he turned to face everyone and did something I did not expect. He told them the truth. He said he and Valerie had asked me multiple times to let Mason move in. He confirmed that I had refused clearly every single time. He admitted there had never been any agreement, permission, or misunderstanding. Most importantly, he said allowing Mason to believe he could pressure me into changing my mind had been their mistake, not mine. My oldest cousin looked at Mason. "You told us she agreed." Mason did not deny it. He could not. Instead, his face crumpled and he began to cry.
For one brief moment, I felt sorry for him. Mason had lost his company, his marriage, his home, and the life he had spent years displaying to everyone. Standing in my driveway, surrounded by boxes and relatives who no longer believed him, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Then he wiped his face, pointed at me, and destroyed the last trace of sympathy I had. "This is your fault," he shouted. "If you had acted like family for once, none of this would have happened." I stared at him. His failed business was my fault? His debt was my fault? His wife leaving was my fault? His decision to lie to our relatives and arrive without permission was somehow my fault too? Mason could lose everything except his ability to blame someone else. I looked past him at the adults scattered across my driveway. "If you honestly believe Mason and his children deserve a free house," I said, "why has nobody offered him theirs?" No one answered. Aunt Denise focused on her steering wheel. One cousin looked down at his shoes. Another muttered that his rental agreement did not allow additional occupants. Someone else explained that their home was already crowded. Every reason was understandable. Every person had boundaries, responsibilities, expenses, and limited space. They simply could not explain why their boundaries deserved respect while mine did not. "I am not criticizing any of you for saying no," I continued. "I am asking why my no was treated differently." The silence that followed was the first honest response I had received all afternoon. Within 10 minutes, every box had been returned to the trailer, the grocery bags were back in Denise's SUV, the folding furniture was secured with straps, and the children were guided into the second car. Mason climbed into the last vehicle without looking at me. He had arrived with an audience and a plan. He left with neither. When the trailer disappeared around the corner, my father remained beside the curb. Valerie stood a few feet away, staring at the empty driveway as if she were seeing the consequences of her choices for the first time. "I am sorry," she said quietly. I did not immediately answer. She had apologized before, but usually in the vague way people apologize when they want discomfort to end. This time, I needed specifics. What exactly are you sorry for? Her eyes filled with tears.
For asking you to leave your own home. For helping Mason ignore your answer. For believing you would eventually give in because you always have. That was more honest than I expected. I did not always give in, I said. You and Dad taught me that refusing him caused more trouble than surrendering. My father looked down. You are right. I folded my arms. I love both of you, but you cannot use me to manage Mason anymore. I will not receive messages asking me to reconsider. I will not discuss giving him money, housing him, or repairing the consequences of his decisions. Valerie nodded. And he is not allowed to come here without my invitation. We understand, my father said. No, I replied. I need you to understand what happens if he tries this again. I will call the police. I will not stand in the driveway debating with the family. Valerie flinched, but she agreed. After they left, I walked through the house checking every door and window, even though I knew Mason had never entered. I felt unsettled knowing how close he had come to forcing himself into my life. That evening, I installed a doorbell camera and ordered 2 additional security cameras for the garage and backyard. I also sent one message to the family group chat. I attached screenshots of my refusals and wrote, "For clarity, I never agreed to let Mason move into my home. He was told no repeatedly. Anyone who was invited to my property today was misled. Do not contact me again to pressure me about housing him." Then I muted the chat. I expected arguments. Instead, apologies began to arrive.
The first apology came from my oldest cousin. He said Mason had told everyone I had agreed, but felt embarrassed about changing my mind publicly. According to him, the relatives believed they were helping me avoid an uncomfortable conversation. Aunt Denise wrote next. I should have called you before showing up, she admitted. I believed his version because the children were involved. That was wrong. Others followed. Some apologies were sincere. Others were clearly written because the truth had become impossible to ignore. A few relatives never contacted me at all, but they quietly deleted their comments beneath Mason's public post. By the next morning, the post itself was gone. Mason replaced it with a vague message about discovering who truly supports you during difficult times. He received far fewer sympathetic responses than before. I did not comment. For the first time, I understood that defending myself publicly had not been necessary. Mason's plan had collapsed the moment people saw the evidence with their own eyes. The following week, my father called. He said Mason was still living with them, but the atmosphere had changed. Valerie had stopped making excuses for him. She told him he had 30 days to find work and begin contributing to groceries and utilities. Mason reacted exactly as expected. He accused her of choosing me over her own son. He claimed the family had destroyed his confidence when he needed support most. Then he threatened to leave and sleep in his pickup. Valerie told him that was his decision. I nearly dropped the phone. My father sounded exhausted, but also strangely relieved. For years, we thought keeping him calm was the same as helping him, he said. I think we only taught him that anger works. You did, I replied. The honesty made him quiet. I know, he finally said. I am sorry. A few days later, Eli came home from college for the weekend and visited me. We sat on the rebuilt deck with coffee while he described what was happening at our parents' house. Mason had started sending job applications after Valani disconnected the television in the room where he was sleeping. He complained constantly, but he applied anyway. 2 companies invited him for interviews. One offered him a position as a project coordinator for a construction supplier. The salary was much lower than what he claimed to have earned through his business, but it came with regular hours and health insurance. Mason initially refused. He said accepting the job would be humiliating for someone with his experience. Valerie told him unemployment was not a position of status. 3 days later, he accepted. I was glad for the children, but I did not contact him. Getting a job was not an apology. It was not accountability. It was simply the first responsible action he had taken in months. Mason began working, yet his anger toward me continued. He told anyone willing to listen that I had destroyed his reputation and turned our relatives against him. He claimed the driveway incident had been a misunderstanding, exaggerated by my need for revenge. But fewer people believed him now. Whenever he tried to retell the story, someone asked why he had said I agreed, when I had clearly refused. Mason never had a convincing answer. Several weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from Valerie. She did not ask me to forgive Mason. She did not ask me to reconsider helping him. Instead, she wrote about the wedding day when he rejected the keychain I had made. She remembered it. For years, I assumed the adults had forgotten. Valerie wrote that she had laughed awkwardly because confronting Mason would have created a scene during the wedding. Then she continued,
choosing temporary peace every time he treated me badly. I thought I was protecting a hurting child, she wrote, but I was teaching him that your hurt mattered less. I read that sentence several times. It did not erase the past. Nothing could. But it was the first time anyone had named what actually happened. I called her that evening. We spoke for nearly an hour. I told her I was willing to rebuild our relationship, but only if Mason was no longer placed between us. I would not discuss his money, his housing, his job, or his feelings about me. Valerie agreed. Then she said something I never expected. You were right to lock the door.
Hearing Valerie say that did not magically repair everything between us, but it mattered. For most of my life, every conflict with Mason had ended with someone asking me to be more understanding. No one had ever said I was right to protect myself. No one had ever acknowledged that locking the door was not cruelty. It was the only reasonable response to people attempting to enter my home after being denied permission. Over the next 2 months, Mason remained at my parents' house while working his new job. Valerie required him to pay a fixed amount toward groceries and utilities. My father helped him create a budget and made it clear that their home was temporary housing, not a permanent solution. Mason hated every boundary. He complained that the contribution prevented him from saving quickly. He argued that parents should help their children without attaching conditions. He reminded Valerie that he had 3 kids and claimed their needs should come before household rules. For once, she did not surrender. You have income, she told him. You have responsibilities. Helping you does not mean carrying you. Eli repeated the conversation to me later, sounding almost amused. It was like watching someone discover gravity, he said. Mason kept dropping things and acting surprised when they hit the floor. Eventually, Mason saved enough for the deposit on a modest 2-bedroom apartment near his workplace. It was smaller than the house he had rented with Tessa, and the children had to share a room, but it was clean, safe, and affordable. He moved out of my parents' home without asking me for furniture, money, or assistance. At least not directly. A week before the move, my father called and carefully mentioned that Mason still needed a dining table. I said nothing. My father immediately corrected himself. Never mind. That is not your responsibility. It was a small moment, but it showed me he was finally learning. Aunt Denise donated an old table from her garage. One cousin offered a set of chairs. Valerie bought basic kitchen supplies for the children. The family still helped Mason, but the help looked different now. Nobody handed him another person's life. Nobody demanded that someone else sacrifice a home. They offered items they genuinely wanted to give and stopped when they reached their own limits. That was all I had ever asked for. Several months after the driveway incident, I received a text from Mason. It was the first direct message he had sent since demanding that I open the door. I suppose you are happy now, it read. I stared at the screen for a while before answering. Happy about what? That everyone thinks I am a liar and you are the victim.
Even then, he could not simply apologize. You told people I had agreed when I had not, I wrote. That was a lie. Their opinion of you came from your actions, not mine. His response arrived almost immediately. You could have handled it privately. I did. I told you no privately. You brought the argument to my driveway. Several minutes passed. Then he wrote, the kids still remember you turning them away. That message hurt because I cared about the children and he knew it. They remember what you told them, I replied. You brought them to a house where you had no permission to live. Do not use them to punish me for refusing you. He did not answer. I assumed the conversation was finished. Then, almost an hour later, another message appeared. I was desperate. It was the closest he had come to admitting anything. Desperation explains why you needed help, I wrote. It does not excuse lying or trying to force your way into my home. This time his reply took longer. I should not have told everyone you agreed. It was not a complete apology. He did not mention the public post, the insults, the years of rejecting me, or the children standing in my yard. But it was an admission. I considered demanding more. Instead, I wrote, no, you should not have. Then I put the phone down. Forgiveness, I had learned, did not require pretending the damage never happened, and an apology did not automatically restore access to the person who had been harmed.
Life became quieter after that. Mason and I did not suddenly become close. We did not meet for coffee, exchange childhood memories, or pretend that one reluctant admission had repaired decades of damage. But he stopped contacting me about the house. At family gatherings, he kept his distance. The first time we saw each other after the driveway incident was at Eli's graduation. Mason arrived with his children and stood on the opposite side of the room. For most of the evening, we barely acknowledged each other. Then his youngest daughter walked over and asked whether my backyard still had the bird feeder. It does, I said. Can I see it sometime? I glanced toward Mason. He was watching us, but for once, he did not interrupt or tell her I was not her aunt. You can visit when your dad arranges it with me first, I said. She smiled and ran back to her siblings. Mason looked uncomfortable, as though respecting a boundary required more effort than arguing against one. Still, he gave a small nod. That visit eventually happened. The children spent an afternoon in my backyard, watching birds, eating pizza, and playing near the maple tree. Mason brought them, remained outside, and left at the time we had agreed upon. No boxes, no trailer, no relatives recruited as an audience. Before leaving, he stood beside his pickup and looked at the house for a long moment. You really did all of this yourself? He asked. Most of it. He nodded toward the rebuilt deck. It looks good. It was the first compliment he had ever given me without attaching an insult. Thank you, I said. Neither of us mentioned the past. Maybe one day Mason will offer a real apology. Maybe he will finally understand that desperation did not entitle him to my home, and blood did not entitle him to control another person's life. Or maybe he never will. I no longer need him to. For years, I thought peace would come when my family finally admitted I had been treated unfairly. I imagined some perfect conversation where everyone apologized, Mason changed, and the past stopped hurting. But peace did not arrive through their understanding. It arrived when I stopped waiting for permission to protect myself. My relationship with my father and Valerie is better now, although different. They call before visiting. They no longer bring Mason's problems to me. When Valerie begins slipping into old habits and defending him automatically, she sometimes stops herself halfway through a sentence. That matters.
Eli visits often. He still jokes that my house is the only place in the family where no is considered a complete sentence. I told him he is welcome anytime, as long as he never arrives with a moving trailer. The security cameras remain installed. At first, seeing them made me feel anxious. They reminded me of the day my driveway filled with people who believed they could vote on who lived in my home. Now they remind me of something else. The door is mine. The key is mine. The decision is mine. Last month, I completed the final major renovation. The detached garage Mason had once dismissed as nearly useless. I replaced the damaged panels, installed new shelves, and turned one corner into a small workshop. When everything was finished, I sat on the steps with a cup of coffee and looked across the yard. The bird feeder moved gently in the wind. Sunlight reflected from the kitchen windows I had installed years earlier. I thought about the frightened little girl holding a handmade gift that Mason refused to accept. She spent years believing that being good, patient, and useful might eventually make someone choose her as family. I wish I could tell her she was asking the wrong question. The important question was never whether Mason would accept her. It was whether she would grow up and accept herself enough to stop surrendering everything for people who refused to respect her. Mason once shouted that I was making his children homeless, but I did not destroy his home. I simply refused to give him mine. And when his army of relatives drove away that afternoon, I turned the key in my own front door, stepped into the life I had built, and understood something clearly for the first time. A boundary is not cruelty just because someone else planned to benefit from you having none.